Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And thank you all for being here on a gorgeous afternoon, no less. I'm Somini Sengupta. I'm the International Climate Correspondent, and I also anchor a twice-a-week newsletter called Climate Forward, which I know some of you subscribe to, and I would encourage others of you to try out. So I was in Glasgow last year for COP26, the International Climate Talks. Mostly, I was trying to buttonhole diplomats and activists inside this cavernous conference center on the banks of the Clyde River. I didn't get out much, but there were these giant floor-to-ceiling windows at the press center, and throughout the day, I would stand by those windows and watch the sky change. Glasgow has the most amazing skies. The clouds moved all day long. Sometimes they created shadows on the water. Sometimes they allowed a ray of sunshine. And then when the sun went down, these three words lit up the night: no new worlds. It was an installation made with 3,000 LED light bulbs by a British artist collective called Still Moving. I couldn't stop looking at this piece. It made me catch my breath several times a day. And it made me think about all kinds of things. The new world part of this made me think about colonialism and the extraction of natural resources that has defined the modern age. The no new reminded me of this one planet that has given everything that our species has needed. And under the changing sky, these lights nudged me to consider actually all that has to change, all of the new ways that we have to and we can imagine inhabiting this world, precisely because we have altered it so profoundly. Fun fact, I learned much later that this was a piece that was originally commissioned for the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower, and it was first originally installed in Plymouth. You've asked me to speak about the road to COP27, the next international climate talks that are now less than, 3 weeks away. I want to do that, but I want to first put this moment in context for you, and then I want to share with you some of the big questions that I think are looming over these negotiations. So we are clearly living in a changed world. The average global temperature right now is about 1.1 degrees Celsius higher today than it was 150 years ago at the beginning of the industrial era. 1.1 degrees Celsius is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's the baseline. That's mainly because of the combustion of coal, oil, and gas for the last 150 years to create electricity, to heat our homes, cool our homes, get us from one place to the other, allow us to eat strawberries in the dead of winter in the Northeast. The combustion of fossil fuels has driven the modern era and brought us many of these modern conflicts. Now, that extra heat in the atmosphere is also making heat waves more severe, making storms more severe, raising sea levels, intensifying wildfires. A glimpse of that you all saw yourself, I'm sure, this year. Boston hit a record 98 degrees Fahrenheit in August. Many other cities hit or nearly hit their temperature records this year. In Europe, rivers dried out. China had an extraordinarily hot and dry summer. India and Pakistan suffered a very, very long heat wave. And then in Pakistan came the rains, extraordinary rains, rains that wouldn't stop, rains that in a matter of days had inundated a third of the country, affecting 33 million people. It's almost hard to, hold that in your head, that level of devastation. I mentioned these extreme weather events because attribution scientists concluded that these specific extreme weather events were exacerbated by anthropogenic climate change. And we can talk about that later if you want. So we are very clearly living on a hotter planet. But here's the thing, the impacts of that are not felt equally, not at all. If you're a farm worker in California, you may be harvesting corn starting at 4 a.m. in the dark because by mid-morning it is dangerously hot. And that constant exposure to extreme heat and wildfire smoke and dust that's kicked up by this mega drought that California is experiencing can make you sicker, can make you poorer. If you're living in a house made of bamboo and tin on the coast of Manila, storm surges are likely to wipe out your home again and again. You may not have insurance to recover from those losses. Like the pandemic, climate change really exposes the sharp inequities in our societies, in each of our societies and between our countries. This is something that I wrote a couple of years ago. It was part of a series called Inequity at Boiling Point. And I'm just going to read you a couple of sentences from one of the stories. If you're poor, you're likely to be much more vulnerable to extreme heat. You might be unable to afford an air conditioner. You might not even have electricity when you need it. You may have no choice but to work outdoors under a sun so blistering that first your knees feel weak and then delirium sets in. Or the heat might bring a drought so punishing that no matter how hard you work under the sun, your corn withers and your children turn to you in hunger. If you haven't read that series and you're interested, I would invite you to just search for that. It's called, the series is called Inequity at the Boiling Point. So is it too late to make a difference? There is some amount of warming baked in because of the emissions in the atmosphere already. However, it is not too late to change course right away to prevent things from getting exponentially worse in our lifetimes. And those two things are sometimes hard to hold in our heads, that, you know, some profound changes are already baked in. Some real degree of heating is already baked in, but how much hotter, how much more extreme weather is in our future, that's not decided yet. That remains to be seen. There are, I want you to take a look at this graph to sort of see the direction of change. So in 2015, before the Paris Agreement came together, the world as a whole was on track to warm an average of nearly 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Today, if all the countries keep all the pledges that they've made, we are on track to warm by around 2.7 degrees Celsius. There's been movement, but according to scientists, nowhere near the scale and the pace of movement that's needed to avert the worst impacts. The scientific consensus says that if total global emissions can be cut by almost half by 2030, total global greenhouse gas emissions, if they can be cut by 45% by 2030, there's a pretty good chance that the world can keep average temperature rise within 1.5 degrees. And if that can be done, then we have a pretty good chance of averting some of the worst impacts. Impacts like widespread crop failures in major breadbasket regions of the world, storm surges that can wipe out not just coastal cities, but entire low-lying islands. That's a huge lift. Cutting emissions by 45% by 2030, it's a huge lift. And that is why this moment matters so much. Not just because COP27 is coming up, but because we are midway between that year when the Paris Agreement came together, 2015, and that North Star year, 2030, by which the world as a whole must make some really major changes. Now comes COP27, 27th year of these international talks. Do you all know what COP stands for? The Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the United Nations agreement and an agency. It's the UNFCCC. COP is all of the parties that agreed to it, basically every country in the world coming together in a conference. So this is the 27th year of these talks. And take a look at this. Take a look at what's happened to emissions in the atmosphere in that time. This is a really interesting way to plot it. In the time that we have known what rising emissions does to global temperatures, okay? Look at how the direction, look at how sharply that curve goes up. So these, in my view, are the 5 kind of big questions that are looming over this session, okay? 1, how does the world adapt to this already changed climate? AKA, how do we live now? How do we redesign cities, protect coastlines and the people who live on the coast? How do we grow food? How do we protect people from extreme suffering? Especially poor people in poor countries who are disproportionately vulnerable. Question number 2, who pays? And especially, who pays for the damages that accrue to people who are least responsible for the problem in the first place? What are they owed? You'll hear some people describe this as climate reparations. In the polite language of international diplomacy, it's called loss and damage. Broadly speaking, the countries of the global south want a separate pot of money for irreversible losses and damages. They don't see this as aid, they see this as what is owed. And broadly speaking, the industrialized countries of the global north, including the United States, say, yes, there are disproportionate impacts. And yes, it's important to give money, particularly after extreme weather disasters, but creating a separate pot of money, a separate loss and damage mechanism could potentially open up the floodgates to liability. So that has been a very contentious issue all of these years, and it really reached fever pitch at the last negotiations. It will be a key flashpoint in this year's talk. So this is an issue to really watch, right? So question 1, how do we adapt? Question 2, who pays? Question 3, who gets to use gas? And by gas, I mean what you might hear referred to as natural gas. It's fossil fuel. Every fossil fuel derives from nature. You might more accurately think of it as methane gas because methane is its principal, ingredient. So what is the future of gas? And it's taken on a sort of, it's taken on increased prominence because Europe relies on a lot of gas from Russia to heat homes, to turn the lights on. And now, as Europe tries to wean itself off of Russian gas, that's given gas producers, including companies in the United States, a new rationale to set up new gas infrastructure, new drilling, new export terminals, new contracts to supply European countries. Then there are a range of African countries who have gas in their lands and waters. Senegal, Angola, Mozambique, Nigeria, they are making the case that they should be able to drill. If anyone should be able to extract gas now, in this moment, it should be their countries because they are responsible for a very small share of historic greenhouse emissions. There's pushback from climate activists on the continent who say, look, we suspect that all these new gas projects that you want to build will supply Europeans and not really address Africa's energy needs. So instead of building new fossil fuel infrastructure on the continent that will remain in place for the next 30, 40 years, many of the climate activists in Africa say, what you should be funding, you international banks and donor nations, is the creation of more renewable energy infrastructure that meets Africa's energy access needs. We wrote about this debate. It's a very, very interesting debate that I think will really play out. And it goes directly to the heart of the equity questions at COP. Question number 4, are big emitter countries, the United States, China, Europe, Japan, Australia, are they pivoting their economies away from fossil fuels quickly enough by 2030 to keep average global temperatures from going past that threshold? Spoiler alert, at the moment, no. There is diplomatic peer pressure on these countries. What about the new US climate law? It's a big deal. It's $370 billion worth of a big deal. Interestingly, it's not quite enough to meet the United States' own climate targets. Gets us quite a bit there, but it's not quite enough. And that brings us to the last question, and perhaps the most obvious question looming over COP27, and that is, how does Russia's war in Ukraine affect global climate goals? This is a war financed by Russia's fossil fuel riches, and a war in which oil and gas has been weaponized. And as you well know, the war has fueled a global energy crisis, truly the first global energy crisis, not just an oil crisis, but a broadly speaking, and a global food crisis. It has upended geopolitics. It has given some investors more reason to continue to invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure in different parts of the world, as I was just saying. Will this conflict slow down climate action, or will it accelerate climate action? That is an open question. And that is, I think, the most important question. Will this stretch out our old ways of living on this planet? Will it strengthen status quo industries and the government leaders who depend on them? Or will it compel governments and citizens to pivot this old world to a new place? This is a question I follow, I write about, and so I will make one more plug for the New York Times Climate Forward newsletter. I invite you to sign up, nytimes.com/climateforward. Thank you so much for your time. Now the part that I've really been looking forward to, when I get to learn stuff from our distinguished panelists. So please, would you join me up here? Our mics. Hi, is this working? Oh, yay. Okay, great. Well, thank you for doing this. And I love that you all come from different disciplines to kind of help us make sense of this moment. I want to start with the science, okay? I want to start with you, Professor Hanqin Tian. You know, I mentioned that 1.5 degree goal, that target. If we cross that threshold, what happens? Can you help us understand that? And really, is it realistic that we can stay within that level of warming? Considering that we're already at 1.1, reaching 1.2, is the 1.5 target even realistic at this point?
Yes, I involved this called new science insight last year. Actually, we reported the result of the COP26. group of scientists they involve IPCC and other international community. The conclusion is yes, we can keep this 1.5 degree, but it needs immediately carbon
Can you list your-
dioxide,
yes.
carbon dioxide emission, but very challenging. Thinking about you just said about 45 or 50%, that's plus minus reduction, which means about 2 million ton CO2 emission have to every year should have been a reduction. That's very challenging. But that estimate actually doesn't include non-CO2 greenhouse gas emission. So if we consider like methane and then nitrogen oxide, that's a nitrogen oxide is a 300 ton global warming potential by carbon dioxide, and also methane is 28 times than carbon dioxide. So that's very challenging, but it needs immediate action. So we can it's a challenge, but it's possible.
Okay. Professor Lacee Satcher, can I turn to you next? Help us understand, what can the social sciences teach policymakers in particular about designing effective climate? And are there any examples that you can think of doing it right, or conversely examples of doing it really wrong because they didn't pay attention to the social science?
Great question. So I first wanted to note that in general, STEM and the natural sciences and to some extent law have kind of had a monopoly on the discussion, the global discussion of climate change. There's this global phenomena, right, for a while. But I think it's important to note that climate change as a natural phenomena, but also an anthropogenic phenomena, is inherently also like a sociological issue, a political issue, an economic issue. It's a psychological issue, a public health issue. So there's definitely room for the social sciences to engage, and they folks in the social sciences have already began to engage in discussion, but also great research. And I think in terms of policy, one of the ways that the social sciences are contributing now and will continue to contribute is just thinking about the effectiveness of past policies in terms of outcomes on human beings at the global level, but also at a more local level, at the state level and the nation state level, right? And so I'm thinking about social outcomes of policies geared towards climate change and sustainability practices, whether it be for corporations or just more newer policies around sustainable cities and how that impacts the health of residents in cities. I think social sciences have, as I mentioned, are actively contributing to that. And then health, I think one of the ways that sociological scientists for sure are thinking about the impacts of climate change is how it impacts the health of communities in really disparate ways. Certain communities that are already under-resourced in many other ways are also bear the brunt of some of the impacts of climate change when you think about things like urban heat islands. And then even natural disasters impact certain communities and are more devastating for certain communities in certain countries. So I think sociology for sure is thinking about that in ways. In terms of actual policy, I haven't seen, I think these very new policies that I guess we're going to be talking about in a bit are going to be important to kind of, for social scientists to see, in the coming decade, how it's impacting and whether these policies are effective. But, so far, I don't know if I can think of good policies so far.
You mentioned corporations, so I want to turn the mic to you, Sandra, Professor Sandra Waddock. What is all this fuss about ESG? It's like it's in the air. Help us understand what is ESG? How does it matter? And why all the fuss?
ESG is environmental, social governance metrics applied to investment, part of the social investment movement, or at least it used to be. And the big fuss is that it's become very mainstream in the past few years. And so people who were in the original social investment movement, or people who studied that, that movement, look at social investing had a kind of moral underpinning in which investors chose to put their money in investments where they made hopefully a positive difference in the world. As ESG has mainstreamed, there's a lot of thought, and I think I concur with that, it's become co-opted by mainstream finance. So that there's a, when BlackRock, for instance, CEO says everything that they're going to invest in is going to be an ESG investment, then one has to wonder, because they haven't even changed the investment strategy a whole lot. And so we're seeing a lot of talk about ESG and a lot of companies that are applying what are thought to be ESG metrics. But also that also applies to what's also called impact investment.
Yeah, I mean, BlackRock is such an interesting example because they are on the one hand facing pressure from activists to get away from fossil fuel investments. On the other hand, facing intense pressure from some Republican states who don't like this promise of ESG from the company. So BlackRock is a really interesting one, not least because it controls a lot of money. You know, Professor David Wirth, can I turn to you about the climate law? You know, it's a lot of money. It's the first climate law in the US, really the first meaningful climate law. It gets a big part of the way to meet the US target, but not entirely. As it rolls out, what are you looking for? Paint a picture of what kind of transformation is possible as this $370 billion, rolls out across the country.
Well, first of all, to put the Inflation Reduction Act in context, we in this country have been on a climate policy roller coaster for the past several years. Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement on his first day in office in January 2021. President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement. And then on Earth Day, April 22nd, he announced the nationally determined contribution target that you were talking about in your presentation, about 50% by 2030. So that was actually a major change in US policy, because even the Obama administration had insisted on knowing where every molecule of carbon would come from before making that statement in during the Obama administration. This was something of a shot in the dark. It was aspirational. It was a high-end goal, something that the president hoped that the nation would achieve. And then, if you remember, we had the discussion over Build Back Better. That fell apart because of the actions of two senators. And then we had West Virginia against EPA in the U.S. Supreme Court over the summer. So those two developments made things look pretty dark for the United States in terms of its contribution. If you go back to the contributions of the United States to new reductions since Glasgow, we account for about 2/3. And if the U.S. were to fall apart on that, it would be bad news indeed. So the fact that we have some legislation is excellent news and cause for relief. The structure of it is basically a series of incentives, a series of subsidies. Now, one can debate whether that is a good structure, getting back to the earlier question to our colleague, whether that is a healthy structure for society in terms of solving the climate crisis. Basically, it's asking the taxpayers to pay for climate reductions. And so, on the other hand, it's the best that we could get under the circumstances. So we have a series of subsidies and incentives that are designed to shift the economy in the direction of clean energy, in the direction of installation of electric vehicle charging stations, and a whole variety of small interventions that collectively will transform society.
And these subsidies are meant to get entire sectors, right? Whether it's the automotive sector or the aviation sector, to make the shift away from fossil fuels and more to renewables. It kind of comes back to a little bit of the equity question that you were raising. Yes, it offers incentives to individuals too. If you put up a solar panel or if you install a heat pump in your home, you get major tax breaks. But is that going to be enough to cross the line? And I think it's a question for you and you, David. Is it going to be enough to expect Americans across the board to be able to, first shell out the money to have solar panels on the roof or a heat pump? It's a big investment. And two, well, let's start with that. Is it going to be enough? And how do you, actually, the second question is like, how do you talk about that? How do you just talk about that with real people? Which is it's a sociological question. It's a psychology question.
Just thinking about that, when news broke about that act, I think in general, environmental activists and environmental justice scholars and activists were slightly enthusiastic about it because the act does represent like incremental progress and change. But I think by and large, many folks who are in environmental justice scholarship and activism who are on the ground working with and speaking with and interacting with communities devastated by the impacts of climate change, they recognize the need for radical change, right? And so the incremental progress that this act represents and that other policies represent just aren't enough. And so in thinking about the individual incentives, for taking on solar energy, I think before we get there, we have to recognize that many people, if we're just thinking about the US, many people don't recognize climate change as an issue. And so if climate change is an issue, why would I as a homeowner even consider solar energy, right? Especially the way that alternative energy sources are kind of talked about in certain news media, right? So we first have to get people to believe that climate change is a real thing and it's a real threat. And it's not a threat to folks in, the Amazon rainforest or halfway across the country, but it's a threat to people, to everyone, but especially and also folks in the US as well.
Do you think that the extreme weather events of the last couple of years have shifted that?
Yes, I think so. In terms of, you were talking about climate attribution science. There have recently been major developments in the science that connect extreme weather events to climate change. It used to be that, I've been in this business for quite a while, it used to be that journalists were discouraged, in effect, by severely criticized if they were ever to say that a particular weather event was related to climate change. The theory being that the science was uncertain and making those sorts of one-to-one connections were difficult. Now the science, as I understand it, I don't work in this field, but the science, as I understand it, has progressed significantly. And that has important implications for the loss and damage that reparations do. If it can be shown that climate change that has been induced by large emitters such as the United States historically is causally connected to harm from to Cuba in the Caribbean, the harm to Pakistan from the flooding that we were talking about earlier on, then there's a much better case to be made that some sort of financial transactions ought to be made those people and those countries hold.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to clarify one thing, the attribution science has really taken off. It doesn't establish causality. It does show that anthropogenic climate change made X heat wave or X storm that much more severe, increased the likelihood or made it more intense, or a particular hurricane packed that much more rain because of man-made climate change. You had something about the.
There's so much, this is so rich. First of all, what you just said, this is a complexity problem. We live in a world of complex adaptive systems and ecosystems that we live in, and the organizations that humans have created, and economic systems are those complex adaptive systems. Causality is, you can't prove causality in complexity. It's just not the case. And to go back to the original question, there's been a concerted effort on the part of certain people to create what's known as a climate of doubt. In fact, there was a big movement by that name. And just as the tobacco companies once basically had a campaign not to make sure that people didn't understand the link between smoking and health problems, there has been significant effort on the part of conservatives to keep people in doubt about climate change, especially in the United States. And so it's not surprising that some of the things that Lacee talked about exist. And part of that is the economic narrative that we have, which completely ignores climate and completely ignores all of the social justice issues that Lacee was speaking of.
One thing that has always struck me when I look at public opinion polls done by the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication and others, the share of people in the United States who are deniers of climate science is actually pretty small. We tend to overinflate their numbers, but the level of concern among people in the United States about climate change and the way it's affecting their own communities is quite high, according to the public opinion polling.
Can I just come back to one of the earlier points, which is the structure of the intervention from the Inflation Reduction Act in the form of subsidies. One of the goals, I think, is not to take on climate per se, but to take on energy use. What people want is the services that energy provides. And so if renewables from electrons that are provided by wind, by solar, by hydro are cheaper, then people will purchase them. And so it's a broad energy swath of energy options that really need to be taken into account. The general public may not be particularly responsive to concerns about climate. On the other hand, they will respond to prices.
Right. Yes, please.
I also want to just kind of give an example of a contribution of social science to this conversation. That gap that you mentioned, where there's in general, people in the US recognize that climate, the merit of climate science, but also aren't as concerned. There's a term called psychological distance that people, folks who have been studying climate change attitudes and climate change action among households across the US. And it's this idea that, yes, I recognize climate change is real, but climate change doesn't happen in the US. Like, it's not something that's affecting US context, it's affecting other parts of the world, right? So like, we see ads and, we may read about some of the larger devastation with the rainforest and just other parts of the world. So for US context specifically, there's that psychological distance that people have. And so they aren't really concerned because it doesn't feel like a threat to them.
I want to just, while I have you, environmental justice is very much on the agenda. There's money to back it up in the latest climate bill. should that money be going towards?
That's a great question. I feel like, well, I think I'll answer it another way. I think I want to speak on behalf of everyone who's, involved in environmental justice, but I think the compromises there with that exist in the bill with the oil and gas industries and funds diverted directly to alternative sources that are still really bad for the environment. So like things like nuclear power are definitely areas where money should kind of be debated away. But if we're just talking about where that money should be invested, I think it starts at the local level, like neighborhoods and cities. There's an example of a really great work being done here in Boston to kind of mitigate the impacts of climate change. There's an organization, Speak for the Trees Boston, that does great work planting trees throughout Roxbury and Dorchester and other parts of Boston that are covered with impervious area, right? So concrete, which absorbs the heat and also gives off a lot of heat, which makes those neighborhoods in the city much hotter than other parts of the city with more green area. So I think investment in nonprofits who are doing like local neighborhood work on climate mitigation is I think one of the ways, but other ways I think too. I'm kind of skeptical about like green capitalism and green development. It feels like an oxymoron, but I think maybe there's room for funds there too.
What you were saying about the trees in targeted neighborhoods is a perfect segue to a question I have for you, Professor Hanqin Tian. We hear a lot about nature-based solutions, and it's got two words that make us feel really good: nature and solutions. And that always raises questions in my head.
Yes.
Are nature-based solutions promising, or some kinds of nature-based solutions promising for some things? And what are the limits?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, very interesting. Last week I been talking about the nature climate solution. What it's important but not enough. As the people now thinking nature climate solution for the land could remove carbon dioxide by 30%. That's very large. And it does not include the ocean. So if you include the ocean plus about another 2 to 3%. So then Boston probably like taking more than half the atmosphere carbon dioxide. That's very, very big deal. So every country now try to qualify and verify how large the natural climate solution for the country. That all the countries want to get bigger, so they get a carbon credit. I think the very important thing is not only this carbon dioxide removal, but also the co-benefit. Like you protect the forest, could protect biodiversity, get clean water. Something like we just published one paper in Nature Climate Change for China. China is a big emitter. They try to look for the plant more tree to like nature climate solution. But our study for the 20 to 2030, only like 6% of the China possibility. That's an important thing that why China government promoted this natural climate solution. Not only remove the carbon dioxide, but also if you plant more tree and green city, you can clear air quality, water quality. You should reduce nitrogen use, could reduce natural oxide emission, but also could reduce natural water. So I think hopefully we should consider this very important climate solution, but also should consider co-benefit.
And I just also wanted to add, just again, thinking about where that money could go. And it may not seem like an explicit environmental justice issue or relative to the act, but I think housing is really important because all of these things that we're talking about, these extreme weather events, extreme heat, the flooding, natural disasters are happening. And there are people who don't have that basic human right of like housing, right? And so investing in basic housing for everyone, I think is one way to start, and always a place where more funds can go.
Interesting. Just on that, nature-based solutions, it can provide really important co-benefits like shade in a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of trees or doesn't have parks for its residents because of historic policies. You know, redlining in a particular city has made some neighborhoods more vulnerable.
Yes.
But the trick is, will those trees survive? Not in a city necessarily, but all the replant, the forestation efforts. Many go up in flames because of wildfires exacerbated by climate change,
Yeah.
or they're not the right trees in the right place. And I wanted to pose the last question to you, Sandra Waddock. You hear of lots of voluntary corporate promises, right? Many of them are, net zero promises that if you look under the hood are to be met with tree planting efforts, except we might forget that those trees may not survive. So I wonder what you make of these voluntary promises. Why now? Is it enough?
Short answer, no, not enough. We need system change at the macro level. You're not going to get system change in the current economic paradigm, which expects businesses to maximize profits at all costs, basically. And the understanding is that's a legal requirement, although it's actually not, according to some law professors. And so we need to shift how we think, what the narrative is about economics. And, to Lacee's point, what if we could figure out a way to use that money to have some groups organize local communities because make the assumption that people in local communities actually know what they need and they have the wherewithal to bring it about if they're given the resources to do that. And if we could help people to shift that narrative, we would help businesses. Businesses can't change individual. The corporate social responsibility is great. There are many companies that are way ahead of our policymakers, which is why I don't have a lot of faith in just policy alone solving these problems. And most companies are not going to make these shifts that are necessary to achieve the climate targets until and unless the system around them changes, and the system around them isn't going to change until we change the economic way we understand economics.
I want to open the floor to questions. I am reminded that one of the first attempts, long time effort to address climate change was to get consensus around a carbon tax to actually tax pollution. That was tried for years and it didn't go anywhere. And so there's a totally different way of
That's not a systems change, that's the policy. And it's an easy fix if we could have passed it. But it isn't going to do the system transform. It's not transforming.
I would love to hear from folks in the audience. Questions for our panel? Yes, please.
I just had a question. You mentioned it was mentioned briefly when talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. Where do you guys think that nuclear power fits into the equation, especially sort of like the pie in the sky nuclear fusion research that's been going on that has made some incremental breakthroughs in the last couple of years, especially this August? Do you think that that's something that should be focused on, or is it more of a novelty project that's not really going to provide many gains?
Would the scientists like to take that on? And David, do you want to take it on as a policy measure?
Well, that's a good question, but I'm not the expert in this area. Yeah, I'm having no answer.
But there's a lot of debate now about nuclear and new generation of nuclear reactors. There still is the need to deal with the waste problem. And that is something that we for generations. It still hasn't been solved. So I think from a policy point of view, nuclear ought to be down towards the bottom as in terms of policy choices, not necessarily here towards the top. Maybe held in reserve as an emergency option. If nature-based solutions and mitigation efforts, additional reduction efforts are not successful.
Do you want to?
No. I don't think that even though the new developments with nuclear power are, innovative, I still think the waste issue is an issue, especially when historically the nuclear waste goes near is brought or it is sited near communities that are already going through enough. So yeah, as David was speaking, maybe one of the last measures for emergencies.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's long been hugely contentious country by country. Some countries, Sweden and France, generate a lot of their electricity from nuclear without too much controversy. In Germany, it's like a super political contentious subject. And the war has drawn new attention to the debate over nuclear, particularly in a place like Germany, which where the government recently, changed its mind about when to close down some of the facilities. So expect this debate to intensify as countries seek non-fossil fuel sources of electricity.
And not to mention the vulnerability of places like Zaporizhzhia, there's the nuclear power
That
plant
too.
in Ukraine. Every time the nuclear debate sort of dies down and appears to have calm, then there's some new
Right.
There's some new disaster. So and Fukushima, the vulnerability of Zaporizhzhia, which is serious business.
Mhm.
So I think that's another factor taken into account with respect to nuclear.
Other questions, please? Okay, I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3. How's that?
Thanks so much for the discussion. I'm Praveen Kumar. I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Social Work. My work is in the area of environmental justice. Before really coming on to the question, one quick note to Somini. I have a very close friend called Akshat Rathi. We worked for Bloomberg the same, and we used to share the same dorm room during our undergrad days. And he actually recommended me to join your Climate Forward newsletter. He does the similar kind of work, yeah. Incidentally, he interviewed Justin Trudeau yesterday on similar issues. So one of the key things that I have observed is that it took 26 COP meetings to really have a dedicated attention towards what is called as just transition. The question is that when there will be a situation that there will be reduced mining that will say occur in Ohio or in Pennsylvania or Michigan and all those areas, or in India, if that situation occurs, are we thinking enough and adequately about all of those fossil fuel workers? What's going to be their situation? I've been doing some work in India, and there are a whole lot of mental health issues that, particularly in those fossil fuel workers who have been traditionally dependent on these mining companies. So are we doing enough? And going back to Somini's point that there is money in environmental justice, and this seems like a low-hanging fruit. So why are we not really talking about this just transition issues within climate change justice and debates? And what's going on in here? It looks like a low hanging fruit. Why are we not really doing it?
I can, I want to hear what you all have to say. I think just transition has been on the table for some years, and some countries have models. Spain has had a really pretty robust just transition program. I believe Denmark before that has more than just transition. I think one of the questions that a lot of countries will have to deal with is this shift from an economy powered by fossil fuels to an economy powered by something else requires a lot of new workers trained in doing new things. There may not be enough people trained to install heat pumps in New York City if New York City soon, requires buildings to make that transition. Just one example, right? So I think that it's not just a question of how do you move coal miners and coal power plant operators, but the question is actually much broader. How do you shift job training, access to jobs for men and women in a new green economy?
And just to add to that, following on the observation about what is the driver of social design, the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, can play an important role here. Because if you leave that to governments, you're not necessarily going to get something that everybody would regard as just necessarily. If you leave it to the market, probably even less so. But I mean, the NGBs, the World Bank, and the other multilateral development banks certainly have their drawbacks, but they do have a systematic way of approaching social issues such as this, particularly ones that involve some transition. So I think that they are, there's been some writing about David Malthus, and just I don't know what the climate. But I think that the World Bank and the other entities could actually play an important role in coming up with a strategy that would get buy-in from countries like India, from Pakistan, from other borrowing countries, make some capital available and on a glide path from where we are now to where we'd like to end up.
I mean, I think the international development banks are under great scrutiny for whether they have risen to the moment of climate change world, whether they are directing their money really to making this transition. Expect to hear much more on that in the coming years. There was a hand there and one hand here. And after those two questions, I really would like to take a question from a woman.
I'm a biology undergrad here and I work in a cellular agriculture lab. And like one of the big things we focus on is how to both make that affordable, but also appealable. So I was wondering, what story does agriculture play in this? And then also, how do we make this appealable? Does it really just come down to the money? Especially in a situation where it is a time crunch. It's certainly a possibility that not enough people will hop on board before that 2030 deadline is met.
I love that story about agriculture. Take it away.
That's probably a question for me. What agriculture actually is the most important sector emitting greenhouse gas. In terms of this natural oxide, methane, and also CO2. So that people now, including the US and other countries, put a lot of energy try to increase the soil carbon sequestration, the carbon storage in the soil. But it's actually is equally important. You need to reduce this N2 emission and also methane emission. So that, but your biology say that this if we increase soil cover the increase substrate for the methane and natural oxide could increase methane and natural oxide emission as well. So we should consider three gas together. So CO2, methane, natural oxide, how we can increase like natural use efficiency, water use efficiency, reduce now CO2 greenhouse emission and also increase soil carbon. So that we still invest lots of money and grant multi-billion-dollar, but one of the very big challenges how this different like they call climate smart practice we can qualify, verify. That's a big challenge.
Here's a fun fact, which I learned when I reported a story on food waste a couple of weeks ago. Nearly 1/3 of the food that we produce using land and water and fertilizer, and we ship it using diesel and trucks, package it, refrigerate it, and we don't eat it. Low-hanging fruit, lots of efforts being tried, both by companies and governments, local and national, to tackle that really huge and kind of grotesque problem of producing too much food amid growing rates of hunger in the world.
We also have a very flawed way of industrial farming that does not, indigenous peoples have lived on the lands in regeneratively for many eons, basically thousands and thousands of years, whereas our fossil fuel-based production methods, both with fertilizers and insecticides and the like, are destroying soil. They are not regenerative, and we need to quickly move to much more regenerative practices. And it's not that we don't know how to do those; they're not quotas efficient. It will take more manpower, personally.
David, did you want to add something quickly?
Very brief, yes, and we also subsidize, so the taxpayers are paying, we also subsidize, it, so the taxpayers are paying for.
There was a question there. No, did I answer the question here? I said 1, 2, 3, and then all right. Keep that way.
Hello. Oh, hi. I'm Julia Workus. I'm a senior here, and my question is about youth involvement in the climate crisis. And I was wondering if any of you could share your opinions, kind of looking forward to COP27, what the barriers are to young voices being heard and having an influential role in the decision-making process and the treaty-making process, given just the justice considerations of youth being more subjected to years of environmental risk imposition and natural resource depletion. So that's kind of a loaded question, but if you have any thoughts about that.
I think one thing that is sort of ironic is that this generation, Gen Z, I'm millennial, so I know what we were learning. We didn't learn anything about climate change in school in K through 12. And I didn't start learning about climate change until I was adult. But I have children, and youth these days, they're learning about climate change causes and impacts in science, right? But as you mentioned, they're not really included in discussions or conversations. Many, youth know, probably just laypersons, probably know a whole lot more about climate change than, older adults, in my generation or higher. So yeah, that it's really ironic that they aren't included, especially because they will be, the shepherds of the earth, once we're long gone. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I do see the irony.
There's no question that sustained and widespread youth protests over the last several years has raised this issue, to the level where it is now. At COP26 in Glasgow, I did a story that basically sort of pointed out the obvious, which was the protests outside were led by and large by young women, and the negotiations inside were led by and large by older men. And that was a contrast that was kind of hard to miss. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm actually an English PhD student, so I work in the environmental humanities. So I've been very grateful to get to learn more scientific terminology for everything. And I'm really invested in thinking about the kind of narratives we tell about climate change, whether it be more about disaster or if it is more about the kind of everyday suffering, you know, or it's more like the kind of crisis ordinary. And I'm curious about how you would recommend framing the narratives, especially in talking about them with students. And if you have any pieces of media that you would recommend that could be useful for teaching and talking about climate change and how it intersects with the everyday. Thank you. Required reading.
Well, I can respond to this. Actually, I moved from deep south, Alabama. They're not really believing in climate change. If you look at the global temperature change over the last 50 years, Alabama, Mississippi is a cooling temperature decrease, but all the other places increase. So they're thinking global warming doesn't matter to me. No, we don't have global warming there. So the states and the university very carefully to speak climate changing or climate variability. So they really like me to use the climate variability term. So when I teach, when I talk to people, I use climate variability, but also use climate change. But one popular way more effectively to tell them that the hurricane is really getting more frequent in the southeast. That's if we go back to 50 and not like this, today is very frequent. And the El Nino effect they get more frequent. Then La Nina making southeast US very wet flooding. So I think making this very flat. So probably we can think about the climate extreme and also talk about climate change. Then people more easily.
I would refer you to, I think it's a bigger problem than just climate change, because we're on the verge of many ecosystem collapses. In fact, we just had one collapse, the crab. I don't know if you saw that thing about the crabs in Alaska. The population has plummeted, and they're not having crab season this year because there are no crabs to fish for, and that we risk that in a lot of our we risk it in many of our forests. We risk it in many places. So I refer you to something like, I think it's David Attenborough, that really looks at things quite systemically. And also then there's a whole huge conversation going on about flourishing and well-being economies, because without businesses are huge drivers of some of these collapsing potentials for collapse. And it's the extractive practices and the fact that we humans in the Western world in particular, in the North, not the South, but the North, view ourselves as humans are separate from nature, distinct from nature. And we are not, we are part of nature. And as my friend David Wirth always says, we can get that out of pill. So I'd refer you to his work on ecological civilization. And there's just a ton of good work that's being done, but it's not the mainstream at this point. And we need to figure out ways to mainstream it.
Well, I think probably we also should think about when you talk about global warming, people don't feel warming. But climate change is more than climate warming, like extreme drought, flooding, many other secondary, like this year, it will really happen. So that's other thing you can think of.
Yeah. There's a columnist for the Times, I'm not sure how to say her name, Margaret Grenfell. And I believe she lives in Nashville, nearby. Her work is very eloquent and very reflective. I mean, it's sort of Thoreau-like, it's reflectivity, it's what I'm looking at in terms of getting something that would be usable in the classroom.
I mean, as a journalist, I personally like to write stories and I like to read stories about people rather than things. So even if they're about things, I try to make it about people because that's what I'm interested in learning. The story that the issue that we were talking about, you know, the young versus the old, the generational gap and the demands of the young. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of the oldest human story. Are young people blaming their elders for messing things up? Right? That's a kind of mythic story, right, of our species. And I would also refer you to fiction, starting with Octavia Butler. The Earthsea trilogy, I think, is some of the most compelling writing about just this. And she was so prescient, you know, having written it so many years ago. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah. There was this student here, and then there was one more question back there. So can we just have like quick ones?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just have a quick question from the kind of like a social sciences aspect of it. I was wondering, because one of the proposed solutions with the energy crisis and with the climate crisis is an increase in solar energy. And one of the main materials used in the manufacturing of solar panels is cobalt, in particular, mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's a lot of child labor, there's a lot of strife. So I guess from like a social perspective, how, when you're trying to solve the climate crisis, can governments, can companies, and can kind of like states, nations as a whole, make sure that they're not contributing to other issues as well in the meantime, like in the short term, trying to fix a problem by contributing to another problem as well, and kind of how do either nations or companies, how do you balance that? Because obviously, like, it's not what you want to contribute to, but how exactly does that balancing act work from like a company perspective, from like a social sciences perspective?
That's a really good question, a really complex question that I'm not sure, but I recognize that issue, especially someone who's like read about the cobalt mining and how the cobalt mining powers a lot of other, you know, phones and all the things we use every day, right? And so solutions, I don't have, I'm not sure, but I recognize that tension, and it's a better question for someone to get.
There are certification programs and the like, and what we need to do is make these issues extremely visible and put pressure on the companies that are producing so that there are standards that are in place, which there are in many of these issues, you know, many of these issues these days. And then make sure that companies that are doing that work, their work is very visible and that they're living up to these standards. And if they're not, then to call them out, which can be done relatively easily today because of social media.
My colleagues and I wrote a series of stories last year called Race to the Future, drawing attention to, shedding light on these problems, cobalt, lithium, and the works. So I invite you to take a look at that series. Last one.
Yeah, in the US. Yeah, so in the US Department of State briefing, someone asked about Indigenous issues. And it's not on the formal agenda for COP27. But I guess I'm curious to hear how you think that Indigenous issues will be covered, especially considering you're so important to environmental justice. and issues of biodiversity and solutions. So yeah, just like your thoughts on that not being formally addressed.
And it's a UN event, and I'm on an IPBES panel, in the governmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services. We are part of the processes that were required to incorporate these days what they call ILK, Indigenous and Local Knowledge. I would be very surprised if that same requirement is not present, but I'm not that familiar with the process. So.
I was gonna say, this will be my first COP, but as a social scientist who, you know, whose work centers on environmental justice, that's something I am looking out for, but this is my very first experience with COP. I haven't been. Do you have any?
Well, the big question is how to, in UNEs, to operationalize those sorts of concerns. In other words, take them from broad and general concerns and turn them into real life policy. And so what one would do would be to look at the junctures at which, say, money is changing hands, financing. There can be conditionality with respect to the financing. The multilateral development banks, if they are mobilized in that direction to encourage social justice, ought to be including those sorts of analyses. And I believe that they either should or do or should have staff that can engage with those sorts of questions. Historically, they have not. So even though Indigenous peoples may not be on the formal agenda, there's plenty of opportunity to take the sorts of insights that come from a serious analysis of that sector and build them into actions that are actually being taken by the delegates that are there, by the states that
I have a request for those of you who are actually going to COP27. I can be found pretty easily. Shoot me an email or send me a Twitter DM if there's a great story that you see. If you have a scoop, I'll be there. I hope that everyone going just has a that it's purposeful for you. Yeah. Any other closing comments from any of you? Are we at time, Jim? Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.